obsessively disciplined. There is a particular quality certain people carry that has nothing to do with talent, beauty, or charm, and everything to do with the unmistakable sense that nothing is going to stop them. It shows up before any accomplishment does, in the steadiness of the routine, the refusal of the shortcut, the eyes that stay on the target long after everyone else in the room has grown bored or distracted. People around a person like this often describe an unease they cannot quite name. What they are actually sensing is discipline with no exit built into it, and discipline like that is, correctly, a little frightening to be near. The masses practice discipline the way they practice most things, inconsistently, with frequent exceptions, abandoned the moment motivation dips or a good excuse presents itself. This version of discipline reassures everyone around it because it confirms that the person practicing it is, at bottom, exactly as governable by circumstance as anyone else. The people in this record practiced something considerably less reassuring, an obsession so total, so unbroken by mood or convenience, that it stopped reading as a personality trait and started reading as a force of nature other people had to plan around. This is not a study in burnout, and it is not a call to punish the body or empty the self out in service of ambition. It is a study in total, directed focus, obsession converted into architecture rather than left to consume whoever carries it. 10 laws follow. Everything ahead depends on a single reversal. The unease your focus produces in other people is not a flaw to soften. It is frequently the clearest evidence that the focus is real. The first law: let your focus be total enough to unsettle the room. Martha Graham maintained a rehearsal and training discipline across her long career that colleagues and students consistently described as uncompromising to the point of intimidation, continuing to train and choreograph well into old age with a rigor that never softened to accommodate comfort, convenience, or the more forgiving pace her decades of accomplishment might reasonably have earned her. Dancers who trained under her described an atmosphere in which the sheer total seriousness of her focus made ordinary effort feel, by comparison, almost embarrassing to offer. Maria Callas approached vocal preparation with an intensity her own collaborators frequently found difficult to work alongside, refusing to compromise a musical or dramatic standard, even when doing so would have made rehearsals considerably easier for everyone involved, and the resulting performances carried a level of commitment audiences found riveting, specifically because it was clear nothing about the performance had been left to chance or convenience. This is the first law. Focus this total is genuinely unsettling to be near, because it removes the shared, comfortable assumption that everyone in the room is operating under the same reasonable limits. The masses moderate their own effort to match the room, worried that focus this complete will make others uncomfortable. The strategist has made peace with that discomfort, understanding that the unease her focus produces in others is simply the accurate reading of a force they correctly sense they cannot negotiate with. There is a documented phenomenon in group dynamics worth naming directly. The presence of one person operating at a genuinely higher standard tends to raise the baseline effort of an entire group, a pattern researchers have observed across teams, classrooms, and creative collaborations alike. The discomfort her intensity produces is frequently the exact mechanism by which everyone around her ends up doing better work than they would have otherwise. Translate this into an ordinary team or family setting. A colleague who visibly refuses to cut corners on a shared project. A family member whose own standards never bend, regardless of what everyone else is willing to accept. The discomfort this produces is real, and it is also, more often than not, exactly what raises the standard of everyone forced to work alongside it. Total focus is only an asset if it is actually aimed at something. Left undirected, the same intensity simply scatters into anxiety. The second law: convert obsession into direction, not distraction. Clara Schumann sustained a demanding career as a concert pianist and composer across decades that also included raising a large family and managing her husband's declining health, maintaining a daily practice discipline rigorous enough that her technical command remained formidable throughout a life that offered her considerably less uninterrupted time than most of her male contemporaries. The obsession with her craft never scattered across every demand competing for her attention. It stayed aimed, specifically, at the instrument and the repertoire, regardless of how many other obligations surrounded that focus. Rosalind Franklin approached X-ray crystallography with a meticulousness her colleagues described as considerably more exacting than the field's ordinary standard, refusing to accept ambiguous or rushed results even when a faster, less rigorous approach would have produced a publishable finding sooner. Her obsession was never with recognition or speed. It was aimed entirely at the accuracy of the data itself, and the images her rigor produced provided the critical evidence for one of the most significant scientific discoveries of the century. The masses experience obsession as something diffuse and consuming, an anxious, scattered intensity that touches everything and settles nothing. The second law insists that genuine obsession, properly practiced, is aimed like a beam of light rather than scattered like static, a single target, sustained attention, and a deliberate refusal to let that attention diffuse across every other demand competing for it. The ordinary version of this discipline requires actively refusing to let genuine intensity scatter across every available outlet. The urge to worry about 10 things at once, to treat every demand on your attention as equally deserving of the same obsessive energy. The strategist asks, before directing any of her focus, whether this specific target is actually the one her obsession belongs to, or simply the loudest one currently competing for it. A directed obsession still requires a mechanism to sustain it day after day. That mechanism is consistency, and consistency has exactly one true enemy: the exception that feels harmless in the moment. The third law: let no single exception break the chain. Anna Mary Robertson, Moses, known as Grandma Moses, painted daily for the final decades of her unusually long life, maintaining the practice without significant interruption, regardless of age, weather, or the considerable fame that arrived only after the discipline had already been sustained for years. The consistency itself, more than any single painting, was the foundation the entire body of work rested on. Emily Dickinson maintained an intensely disciplined private writing practice across decades, producing nearly 1,800 poems through a routine sustained with a consistency her limited public recognition during her own lifetime never once interrupted or diminished. The output was not the result of periodic bursts of inspiration. It was the accumulated result of a practice that simply never stopped, regardless of whether any particular day felt inspired at all. The masses treat a single missed day, a single lowered standard, a single justified exception as harmless in isolation, and it usually is, examined alone. The third law identifies the actual danger. It is never the single exception that damages a standard. It is the psychological permission that exception grants for the next one, and the one after that, until the unbroken chain that made the standard meaningful has quietly become an ordinary, breakable habit like any other. There is a principle from the study of habit formation worth naming directly. A behavior repeated without interruption strengthens considerably faster than one interrupted even occasionally, because each break requires the entire pattern to be reestablished rather than simply continued. The strategist protects the unbroken chain specifically because she understands that the value of the standard lies disproportionately in its continuity, not in any single instance of it. An unbroken chain determines how consistently you work. It says nothing yet about when, and some hours are considerably more valuable to claim than others. The fourth law: claim the hours no one else is competing for. Florence Nightingale, following her return from the Crimean War in declining health that largely confined her to her home, continued directing sweeping reforms to sanitation and nursing practice for decades afterward, working at hours and with an intensity that visitors described as tireless, producing volumes of statistical analysis and correspondence from a sick room most observers assumed had ended her working life entirely. Maya Plisetskaya maintained a rehearsal discipline throughout her long ballet career that colleagues described as considerably more demanding than her company's official schedule required, arriving early and remaining late for additional practice that no one else on the roster was competing to claim, building a technical command that continued to develop long after most dancers' careers had already peaked. The masses treat the standard working day as a fixed container, competing with everyone else for the same visible hours everyone else is also using. The fourth law asks a colder question: Which hours, before or after the ones everyone else claims, are sitting entirely uncontested, available to whoever is disciplined enough to actually use them. The advantage available in those hours is considerable, precisely because almost no one else is competing for it. The ordinary version of this law shows up in the quiet hour before a household wakes, or the hour after everyone else has already decided the day is finished. Very little competition exists for that time, precisely because most people have already conceded it, which means whatever a strategist builds inside it accumulates with almost no one else contesting the same ground. Claiming uncontested hours protects when the work happens. The fifth law protects something different. Who gets to witness how intense that work actually is? The fifth law: let intensity live in private, let calm live in public. Frida Kahlo produced an extensive body of paintings while managing chronic physical pain following a near-fatal accident in her youth, maintaining, in much of her public presentation, a composed and carefully constructed persona that gave only selective, deliberate glimpses of the private intensity actually driving the work, a discipline that kept the raw material of her obsession from being fully legible to an audience that had not earned complete access to it. Beatrix Potter conducted years of rigorous, largely private scientific study of fungi and botanical illustration before the far gentler, more publicly familiar children's stories she eventually became known for were ever published, maintaining a considerably more exacting private discipline than the public-facing, whimsical persona her books eventually built for her ever revealed. The masses let their visible intensity match their private intensity exactly, exhausting themselves publicly in a way that invites both sympathy and scrutiny in equal measure. The fifth law suggests a more protected arrangement. Let the obsession do its most demanding work in private, and let the public self remain composed, giving away only what actually serves the woman doing the work, rather than everything the work required of her. This requires resisting a specific modern pressure, the expectation that visible effort or visible struggle is owed to an audience as proof the work is real. The strategist understands that proof lives in the results, not in a public display of exactly how much the results cost her, and she protects that distinction deliberately. A private, protected intensity determines how the obsession is experienced. The sixth law concerns where, exactly, that obsession should actually be spent. The sixth law: obsess over the detail. No one else is patient enough to notice. Julia Morgan personally oversaw construction details across her decades-long architectural career with an obsessiveness her own clients occasionally found excessive, reviewing craftsmanship at a level of granularity. The precise fit of imported tile, the exact grain of a particular wood, that considerably slower, more demanding standards than a faster-moving competitor would have tolerated, producing buildings whose durability and craftsmanship have outlasted the faster, less obsessive standards of her era's more commercially minded competitors. Marie Tussaud developed wax modeling techniques with an obsessive attention to anatomical accuracy that distinguished her work from cruder competitors in the same craft, studying her subjects with a level of detail, the precise structure beneath the skin, the exact texture of aging or expression that turned an already skilled craft into something considerably closer to scientific precision. The masses compete on the details a market or an audience notices immediately, saving their effort for whatever is visibly rewarded. The sixth law suggests the opposite investment. The detail no one else is patient enough to notice, refined obsessively anyway, becomes the specific, durable advantage that separates work, built to last, from work built merely to satisfy an immediate glance. Most competitive fields reward whatever a customer or an audience notices on first impression, which means almost no one is competing on the details a first impression misses entirely. The strategist who obsesses precisely there is, in effect, competing in a field with almost no one else in it. Obsessive attention to detail is only sustainable if the instrument producing it is maintained with equal rigor. The seventh law addresses the discipline most obsessive people neglect entirely. The seventh law: make rest a discipline, not an absence. Wilma Rudolph maintained an exacting daily training regimen throughout years of physical rehabilitation and athletic development, treating recovery and conditioning with the same rigorous scheduling she applied to active training itself, understanding that an obsession pursued without disciplined recovery simply breaks down the instrument the obsession depends on. Gertrude Ederle prepared for her channel crossing through a rigorous, carefully structured training regimen that included deliberate conditioning for cold water endurance, built up gradually and systematically over considerable time, rather than through sheer, undisciplined effort alone. A regimen that treated preparation and recovery as equally rigorous halves of the same total discipline. This is the seventh law, and the one most frequently misunderstood. Obsessive discipline that never rests is not an intensified version of discipline. It is simply an undisciplined relationship with the body's actual limits, dressed up as commitment. The strategist obsesses over her recovery with the exact same rigor she applies to her effort, understanding that a schedule with no restoration built into it eventually produces a body or mind too depleted to sustain the obsession at all. This is worth stating plainly because it is so often misunderstood. An obsession is not more serious for being unsustainable. A discipline that collapses in year 2 because it never accounted for recovery was never actually as rigorous as one built to run for 20 years, because rigor includes accounting for the instrument's actual limits, not simply ignoring them until they force a stop no one chose. Disciplined rest sustains an obsession across years. The 8th law addresses the single most common place that obsession quietly ends anyway, the moment it becomes comfortable. The 8th law: refuse comfort as a stopping point. Toni Stone continued training and competing at a level matching her male teammates in professional baseball, despite the considerably more comfortable option of accepting a lesser, separate standard that would have required less of her, refusing across her career to let the available, easier accommodation become a stopping point she settled into, instead of the standard she had actually set for herself. Bessie Coleman refused the comfortable option of abandoning her aviation ambitions when every domestic flight school rejected her, learning an entirely new language and traveling to another country, rather than accepting the comfort of a more conventional path, considerably easier to walk. The masses treat comfort, once reached, as evidence that enough effort has already been made. The 8th law insists that comfort is simply the point at which continued obsession requires the most discipline to sustain, precisely because it is the first point at which stopping would be easy to justify. The masses treat arrival at a comfortable plateau as the natural end of an effort, a reasonable place to finally rest on what has already been achieved. The strategist recognizes comfort as simply the next test, no different in kind from the earlier tests that got her there, only better disguised, because this one arrives wearing the appearance of a legitimate reason to finally stop. Refusing comfort protects your own standard. The 9th law extends that same standard outward, to everyone working close enough to be affected by it. The 9th law: let your standard raise everyone working near you. Estee Lauder personally tested products with an obsessive attention to quality that her own sales staff and chemists were required to match, insisting on standards for texture, scent, and presentation considerably more exacting than the broader cosmetics industry of her era typically demanded, and the discipline she modeled personally became the operating standard her entire growing company was built around. Madame Clicquot maintained an obsessive standard for the clarity and quality of her champagne house's product, developing and insisting on production techniques more exacting than competitors were willing to sustain, and the standard she modeled personally across decades of management became the benchmark her entire house's later reputation was built on. The masses assume a high personal standard is a private matter, relevant only to their own individual output. The 9th law suggests something more expansive. A standard obsessively modeled, consistently and visibly, tends to recalibrate what everyone working nearby considers acceptable, simply because mediocrity becomes considerably harder to justify next to a standard this uncompromising. This works through modeling rather than instruction. No one needs to be told to work harder when the person beside them is visibly, consistently operating at a level that makes a lesser effort feel conspicuous by comparison. The strategist raises the room's standard simply by refusing to lower her own, regardless of whether anyone ever asks her to. 9 laws describe the specific mechanics of total, directed discipline. The final law names what all of them, sustained together, actually look like from the outside. The 10th law: let the obsession that terrifies them be simply the focus they never sustained. Anna Pavlova maintained a rehearsal and performance schedule across her career that colleagues frequently found exhausting simply to witness, continuing to train with an intensity that never relaxed regardless of her already considerable fame, reportedly explaining her refusal to rest in a phrase that has outlasted most of the specific performances it described: that stopping simply allowed rust to set in. The discipline was not effortless. It was total, sustained precisely because she never treated her own acclaim as a legitimate reason to ease it. This is the final law, and the truth every other law in this record has been building toward. The obsession that unsettles other people is rarely something mysterious or unnatural. It is simply focus, sustained completely and without the usual exceptions, by a woman who decided the target mattered more than anyone else's comfort, with how completely she was willing to pursue it. 10 laws. 1 underlying discipline. Focus complete enough that it requires no audience, no permission, and no exception to keep going. Closing. On the discipline that needs no one else's permission to continue, none of the women in this record were reckless with themselves. Each of them built recovery, direction, and private restraint into an obsession that, left unmanaged, could easily have consumed them instead of the goals it was actually aimed at. What made their discipline unsettling to witness was never its intensity alone. It was the total absence of the usual exit, the missed day treated as harmless, the comfortable stopping point accepted as enough. The masses will always find a reason to ease the standard, and will always find another person willing to ease it right alongside them. You now have 10 laws describing a different, considerably rarer discipline. Focus so complete it requires no audience, no permission, and no exception to keep going. Let it make them uneasy. That unease was never a flaw in the plan. It was the plan working exactly as intended.